Welcome, everyone, to another episode of On the House with Spartan Invest. Today, we're going to be talking about all things HVAC and the pending changes and how it could possibly affect you as homeowners or if you own rental property. I'm joined today by Nate Clark. He is our HVAC technician with Corinth Construction. So he's our in-house HVAC expert. Thank you so much for joining us, Nate.
Of course, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so very quickly, I'm going to have to read it because I don't want to mess this up. But the biggest change, it's a mandated transition from the widely used R-410A refrigerant to eco-friendly alternatives. So we're going to discuss that in depth and how that could affect rental properties, home ownership, and basically what that is. But really quick, before we get into that, Nate, tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience, kind of your history with working with HVACs.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I've basically been in the construction industry my entire life. I started my career in HVAC with a apartment complex, actually doing some basic repairs, handling refrigerants, that type of stuff. And then I proceeded to get my certifications, my 608 certification, and then my career just went from there. Did custom home building, and then I'm working with you guys.
Yeah, and how long have you been with us?
Going on third year now.
Yeah, I love it. Absolutely love it. So I talked very briefly about it. I had to read it per se, but tell us kind of what's happening. What is this change that we're going to be discussing today?
Okay, perfect. So this change basically happens every so often. As in the past, we've had several other freons where refrigerants. We had an R22, and then we have the current refrigerant right now, which is the R410A. And then there's been some little other freons going in between those two. But currently, the EPA has come out with a newer refrigerant that's going to basically has a lower GWP, which is global warming potential, and it's more eco-friendly for the environment. That is basically what's happening with that refrigerant. And then the only thing I would say for homeowners is to not be alarmed that this change is happening. Every so often, the EPA comes out with newer refrigerants, and it's nothing to be alarmed or shook up about. And we'll just have to roll with it and move forward.
When was the last time the change happened? When was the last time that we moved towards the R-410A?
I believe it was sometime in the 2008, 2010 era, if I remember
Gotcha.
the dates correctly.
So this happens, right? Like you said, nothing to be alarmed about, but there is some notable actions that are going to happen over the next few years that are due to this change. Can you tell us, hey, what from a property owner or an investor standpoint, what do they need to know about the upcoming change?
I think the biggest thing would be equipment availability and equipment costs going up. That's really the only effects that we're going to have, because for the most part, in the last changes that we've had, the equipment had a overlap of refrigerant from changing from one to the other. So this time there's not really a lap. They're still going to be selling certain equipment to a certain point, and then when the change happens, there's going to be a gap between when the new refrigerant comes out and the old refrigerant has stopped being made. So in that time period, there might be some equipment supply issues from vendors, but as of right now, I have not experienced any of those. We're still, working through the situations, obviously, because this is new for everybody. So,
And when does this change officially take place?
it will So there are some companies that have already done the complete swap. They're still using the 410A refrigerant currently for some systems, but they're already selling the new systems. I believe it's February, the end of February, when this change is actually going to happen.
Now, how long do you think it'll take to phase out? Like you said, some companies have completely stopped making it, but how long do you think it'll take to phase out that R410?
So it could vary. With 22, I mean, R22 was phased out in around 2008, 2010, and it's still floating around. So, I mean, if that gives you a time period of
Yeah.
how long it could could last. I mean, that equipment, there's still R22 systems that are running to this day and work great. So I don't really know if I have a number in mind that's just going to let the 410A just fizzle out completely. I'm not sure if it'll be 10 years, 15 years, or shorter. So,
Do you think that HVAC companies right now are going out and buying in bulk all of the R410A that they possibly can to kind of house it so they can continue to service? Or do you see that a lot right now?
I don't. Since there hasn't really been a supply issue I mean, there's been a little bit of supply, but most of the time you can find the equipment at some point, or maybe wait an extra day and they can get it for you. So, as far as equipment or refrigerant, I don't think there's been anybody that's just bought up in bulk. Um, if there has been somebody, and I'm sure there has been, I haven't actually personally witnessed that.
All right, Nate. So I'm not the HVAC expert, not even by a long shot. You are, but I would imagine from a property owner or an investor standpoint, investor that owns real estate, the biggest challenges are going to come, or maybe the biggest cost for this change is going to come when something happens to their current unit. So if something happens to a current unit, is it repairable, or guess does it matter if something, does it depend on what the actual issue to the unit is? How is that going to work?
Yeah, so it will definitely depend on what the issue on the unit actually is. Like if your unit and the current refrigerant 410A is out of refrigerant and we've already made the swap, then and if 410A is not readily available for that HVAC contractor, if they don't have it, then that would be something you would have to discuss as far as replacing the equipment to the new systems. And then that's where the more expensive cost would come from, swapping all the equipment out to the new stuff. As far as the rest of it goes, that just depends on the extensiveness of the repair.
So if it's something like the compressor, usually the HVAC technician would be able to go find the compressor for that particular unit and replace it, and they wouldn't have to upgrade to the new unit. But essentially, the refrigerant for the old units will not work in
Correct.
newer units, and vice versa. You can't put the old refrigerant in new units. So at some
Correct.
point, if they're not making it anymore, we are going to have to upgrade.
Yes.
Right?
Correct.
Man,
You're
and
right.
what is the biggest difference between, like, why won't one refrigerant work in another? What is that? What's the biggest difference between those units?
So there are some components in those units that are a little bit different. The oils and the compressors different, and then obviously with the lower GWP and the newer refrigerant, it has a different mixture completely. I'm not a chemist by any means, so I'm not exactly sure what the chemicals that are in those refrigerants 100%, but they don't mix. So they basically, if you think of it like putting oil in a cup of water, if you pour the oil in the cup of water, the oil sits on top of the water. That's basically the mixture difference between the two freons. They won't mix at all.
Okay. And as far as the flammability, I know that we've talked a lot about that and safety concerns, and I feel like a lot of the new training has very much come out and say, hey, it is not any more flammable. But there was that fear at first when rolled out that this might be a safety issue. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so the new refrigerant, it is they are going to use it is a flammable refrigerant, but the flash point on it is so low that it's basically not flammable to anything that's in anybody's household. So what it takes to actually combust that refrigerant or that gas from the refrigerant is so low that when people were so worried about it, it's not really anything to be worried about. The only thing, as far as the flammability of it, is more towards the service technician because it changes the pressures on the unit and components on the equipment.
Gotcha. So if you to our listeners that are investors or have properties out there right now, what advice would you give them? Would you say, hey, go out and change your unit now? Or would you recommend that they, maybe have their current unit serviced? Or what advice would you give them to kind of, hopefully head off any cost in the coming years?
Yeah, for sure. I would say if the equipment's probably in that 5 to 8 year range already, I would think I would go ahead and put it in your mind as far as replacing it to the new stuff. I wouldn't say go running to replace it, because you may get 15, 25 years out of that unit and would have never had to have replaced it. But on the flip side, if it goes down in the next year and there is an equipment shortage or you can't find certain parts to fix it, then you're obviously going to have to pay more than you would have if you just already replaced it.
I gotcha. What is the cost difference like between the current units and the new units for the new refrigerant?
So, but just with our vendors that we use for all of our equipment, we're getting somewhere in a 20 to 25% increase in equipment cost.
Wow.
Yeah,
And that's really important. And again, we don't have to go too much in the weeds about refrigerant and all of the different components of it, et cetera. But to know that that's a sizable increase,
it
especially
is.
given the height of current construction costs and what we've seen over the last few years. In your opinion, do you think that that would be worth it, or do you think that this change is not necessarily essential, or what are your thoughts, just opinion wise?
I mean, my thoughts, I think we all have to be very, what's the word, fluid with the situation and continue to be able to roll with the punches. I know everybody doesn't have tons of money just to blow on an HVAC system when their system goes out on them. So I understand that aspect of it too. So as far as my opinion on it, I think it's a good thing, especially for global warming. Anything that's more economically friendly is great. As far as the service side of it goes, any technician that spends a lot of time and tries to increase their education and all the refrigerants is great as well. So I'm happy about it.
Nate, how do you think these HVAC system upgrades do you think they're going to impact tenant satisfaction at all, or maybe even overall property value?
I think currently it would probably help property value for sure. Especially anytime you put a new HVAC system on a property, whether it's equipment or ductwork or any type of upgrade, you're going to have tenant satisfaction that's going to go higher because your efficiency is higher. You're going to have tenants that are going to have cool houses in 80 degrees or warm houses in the winter. And as far as the new equipment, anything that's newer, that has a newer design, is obviously going to bring value to the house because that's a selling point.
All right, so we have investors. As you know, most of our investors do not live in the Southeast. They don't live and reside in Alabama. We set up as far as any investor across the country and world can invest in Alabama because we handle absolutely everything. So a lot of our investors are not necessarily going to hire Corinth HVAC if they've got properties in other locations. So for those of you who are listening, what advice would you give them when if they do have an HVAC issue with another property and they're having to hire and talk to other HVAC technicians? What should they be asking them about this change?
That's a really good question. Anytime you hire an HVAC contractor, I think some good questions would be basically the same questions you ask about the different types of refrigerant. What are the changes? What's the equipment differences? And then obviously the cost would be the big kicker there. But if their replies are simply, I'm not really sure, I haven't done much of this equipment yet, it's a new design, that type of stuff, I would probably steer clear away from that type of response versus somebody that said, all of our technicians have taken training on the job and off the job. We've done a lot of different units. We've done repairs. We've done installs on this specific unit. That would give your investor a lot more confidence in who you're hiring.
Yeah, that's great advice, right? Because we want someone who is knowledgeable with this change and
Yes.
especially not necessarily adding cost when it's not needed. If, my fear would be bringing with any kind of change in an industry that you're not extremely knowledgeable in, and you have to rely on the trade experts. I would be fearful that a company might come in and be like, "Hey, look, your compressor's out. You've got to upgrade to this new unit."
Right.
And impose an upgrade that might not be necessary. So I think that's a really good point in making sure you're asking these questions and that you are informed of this change and know, hey, when it might be required and when it might not be required to add that extra expense. Because
Exactly.
like you said, the HVAC may last another 10, 15 years if you're lucky. It
Yep.
really just, it kind of depends. So that's really good advice. Any other advice you might have for owners out there or for our investors, listeners?
I don't think so. I think the biggest thing for me, the most word on the street that I've heard people complain about is just being worried about the change and mostly the flammability. And I just wanted to reiterate, don't be alarmed. It's a change. It's coming. It's happening, whether we like it or not. Um, it's going to happen, and it has happened for the last, very, very long time. There's been changes. So that's the biggest thing I would say. Just don't be alarmed, and just, be confident in your HVAC contractors that we've taken the training and all the necessary steps to be able to properly put in a system at your house.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And it's just really being knowledgeable of that change, right?
It
It's
is.
just it's hard to be in the know about absolutely every change that's going on, especially if it's
Yes.
outside of your bubble and your industry. So that's why we do these type podcasts, and so we can get that information into the hands of investors and listeners. So I really appreciate you, Nate, for coming on here and talking
Of
about
course.
this with us. And thank you so much for jumping on.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, guys, that's On the House with Spartan Invest.